I disappeared for 6 months and lost everything that mattered to me. My friends stopped calling, my network forgot I existed, and my social media presence flatlined. Most people would call this a disaster. I call it the most important thing I ever did for my personal growth. But here's what nobody tells you about strategic disappearance. It can destroy you just as easily as it can transform you. The difference lies in understanding the psychology behind it and having the right framework to navigate the inevitable mental warfare that comes with erasing your old identity. Most people think strategic disappearance is about willpower and discipline, but the real enemy is your brain's hardwired resistance to identity change. Your nervous system operates under a principle called identity homeostasis, which means it actively fights against any transformation that threatens your current sense of self. When you attempt to change too rapidly through disappearance, your brain interprets this as a survival threat and triggers powerful psychological defense mechanisms designed to pull you back to familiar patterns. The first trap is social isolation backfire. When you remove external validation from your life, your brain experiences a dopamine crash similar to withdrawal from an addictive substance. This crash creates an overwhelming urge to seek the very connections you're trying to escape. You'll find yourself checking your phone compulsively, creating elaborate justifications to reach out to old contacts, or even manufacturing emergencies that require you to break your disappearance. Your brain has learned to associate social feedback with survival, so removing it triggers panic responses that can sabotage your entire transformation process. The second trap manifests through internal resistance patterns that your subconscious mind creates. Let me give you a specific example. 3 weeks into your disappearance, you'll start having thoughts like, maybe I'm being too extreme, or I should really check on my family, or this isolation might be damaging my career prospects. These thoughts feel logical and reasonable, but they're actually elaborate psychological justifications designed to pull you back to familiar behaviors. Your subconscious mind disguises these resistance patterns as practical concerns because it knows you're more likely to respond to logic than to admit you're experiencing fear of change. Neuroplasticity research reveals why this happens. Your brain interprets radical identity shifts as existential threats because your current neural pathways represent years of learned survival strategies. When you suddenly remove familiar environmental cues and social interactions, your brain activates fight-or-flight responses designed to restore the status quo. This biological programming explains why transformation feels so uncomfortable and why your mind generates so many creative excuses to abandon your disappearance strategy. The third trap creates a dangerous echo chamber where self-doubt amplifies exponentially. Without external feedback loops, your internal critic becomes the loudest voice in your head. Small concerns become catastrophic fears. Minor setbacks feel like complete failures, and productive self-reflection transforms into destructive rumination. You lose your ability to accurately assess your progress because you have no reference points beyond your own increasingly distorted perspective. Hey, here's the shocking reality. 73% of people abandon their transformation within 30 days. This failure rate has nothing to do with lack of motivation and everything to do with biological programming working against conscious intention. Your brain will use every psychological weapon in its arsenal to restore familiar patterns because familiarity equals safety in your nervous system's primitive logic. Successful disappearance requires working with your psychology, not against it, by learning to identify which trap you're falling into before it derails your progress. Recognizing these traps is only half the battle. Here's the paradox nobody talks about. The same isolation that creates space for growth can become the very thing that destroys your mental resilience. The critical distinction between productive solitude and destructive isolation isn't fixed. This line shifts constantly based on your internal psychological state and the specific circumstances surrounding your disappearance. What starts as healthy space for transformation can cross into dangerous territory without you even realizing it's happening. After 2 to 3 weeks of strategic disappearance, unexpected psychological responses emerge that catch most people completely off guard. Your anxiety levels spike as your brain searches for familiar social cues that no longer exist. Decision paralysis sets in because you've removed the external feedback systems you normally rely on for validation. Most dangerously, you develop a tendency to romanticize your old life, remembering only the positive aspects while forgetting why you needed to disappear in the first place. Social feedback loops normally regulate your sense of reality through constant micro-interactions with other people. These loops provide continuous calibration for your thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. When you sever these connections during disappearance, your internal compass loses its external reference points. Without this social calibration, your perception becomes increasingly distorted, and your ability to assess reality accurately deteriorates rapidly. Research on solitary confinement reveals that even voluntary isolation triggers psychological psychological responses similar to those experienced by prisoners. Your brain develops hypervigilance as it constantly scans for threats that don't exist. Rumination increases dramatically because you have no external stimuli to interrupt negative thought patterns. Your self-perception becomes distorted as you lose the mirror that other people normally provide for your identity. Warning signs that your strategic disappearance has crossed into counterproductive territory include sleeping pattern disruptions, increased irritability over minor inconveniences, difficulty concentrating on simple tasks, and obsessive thinking about past conversations or future scenarios. You might find yourself having imaginary arguments with people from your old life or creating elaborate fantasies about dramatic returns to your previous social circles. Maintaining clear purpose requires 3 anchoring techniques that prevent psychological drift during extended isolation. First, establish daily identity reinforcement rituals that remind you why you disappeared and what you're building. Second, create structured progress markers that provide objective feedback about your transformation journey. Third, maintain a single trusted connection who can provide reality checks without pulling you back into old patterns. Successful disappearance requires planned connection points strategically designed to maintain psychological equilibrium. These aren't random social interactions, but carefully chosen touchstones that support your new identity without compromising your transformation process. The complete system for distinguishing productive solitude from destructive isolation involves daily assessment questions. Am I moving toward my new identity or away from discomfort? Are my thoughts becoming clearer or more confused? Is my isolation serving growth or avoiding responsibility? Even with perfect isolation management, the journey back to connection presents unique psychological challenges that can undo months of progress. The most dangerous moment in your transformation isn't during the disappearance. It's when you decide to come back. Your newly formed neural pathways exist in a state of extreme fragility during reintegration. These fresh mental circuits haven't had enough time to solidify into permanent patterns, making them vulnerable to old environmental triggers and social expectations that can erase months of progress in minutes. Most people lose their transformation gains within 48 hours of reconnecting with their old social circles. Willpower alone cannot protect against this regression because the forces working against you operate below conscious awareness. Your brain automatically reverts to familiar behavioral patterns when exposed to the same environmental cues and social dynamics that shaped your previous identity. Friends, family, and colleagues unconsciously pressure you to return to your previous identity through subtle social cues that feel innocent but carry enormous psychological weight. Your college friend makes a joke about how serious you've become. Your mother asks when you're going back to normal. Your coworkers treat your new boundaries as temporary quirks rather than permanent changes. These interactions trigger identity confusion because the people closest to you expect the old version of yourself, not the person you've worked to become. Environmental psychology research demonstrates how physical and social contexts override conscious intention with frightening efficiency. Walking into your old office building, sitting in familiar restaurants, or even hearing specific music can activate neural networks associated with your previous identity. These environmental triggers pull you back into old behavioral patterns before you realize what's happening, bypassing your rational decision-making processes entirely. Mental fortitude techniques create psychological armor during reintegration through a 3-layer defense system. First, identity anchoring statements that you repeat before entering challenging social situations. Second, environmental modification strategies that minimize exposure to your strongest behavioral triggers. Third, strategic response scripts for handling identity challenges from people who knew your old self. The timeline framework tracks transformation progress during the most disorienting reintegration phases. Weeks 1 through 3 focus on controlled exposure to low-stakes social situations. Weeks 4 through 6 introduce moderate challenges with trusted individuals. Weeks 7 through 12 test your new identity under increasing social pressure. Successful identity integration shows specific metrics, consistent behavioral choices across different environments, reduced anxiety when asserting boundaries, and natural expression of your new values without conflict. The strategic reintroduction protocol involves gradual exposure to old environments while maintaining your psychological framework. Start with individual meetings rather than group settings. Choose neutral locations instead of emotionally charged spaces. Prepare conversation scripts that redirect identity challenges back to your current priorities. Preparing your support network before disappearing sets proper expectations for your return. Explain that you're undergoing intentional change, not running from problems. Specify the type of support you need and what what behaviors will undermine your progress. Strategic disappearance isn't about permanent isolation, it's about creating psychological space to rebuild yourself, then choosing which connections serve your new identity. Strategic disappearance isn't a retreat from life, it's the most aggressive form of personal development you can undertake, but only if you understand the psychological warfare involved. Your brain will fight you every step of the way, using sophisticated defense mechanisms to pull you back to familiar patterns. The framework I've shared today will determine whether your disappearance becomes a transformation or a cautionary tale. You now have the mental models to navigate identity homeostasis, avoid isolation traps, and protect your new neural pathways during reintegration. Your old identity is comfortable, predictable, and ultimately limiting. Strategic disappearance is your nuclear option for breaking free.